The vision received was that of blood cells, traveling throughout the body, supplying the much-needed oxygen and other nutrients to the differing members of the body to fulfill their purpose. Once the blood cells are spent, they must return back to the heart to be refilled before being sent out again and fulfill their purpose. Blessings and peace to all you who are listening, brothers and sisters, faithful listeners to our Father's Heart podcast. Welcome. We are in the midst of a series that I'm calling Now That the Holidays Are Over. And as I embark on this particular episode, I'd like to introduce to you what may be a new word to many of you. The word is amalgamation. And when I look in Merriam-Webster's dictionary, it says the amalgamation is the action or process of uniting or merging two or more things. And if I scroll down just a little bit, it says, because it's trying to differentiate between acculturation, assimilation, and amalgamation, it says amalgamation refers to a blending of cultures rather than one group eliminating the other, which is acculturation, or one group mixing itself into another, assimilation. I happen to think amalgamation and assimilation are very, very closely tied together, rather than acculturation, which is one dominating over the other. But this word, I think, is very important in understanding the progression, the metamorphosis that has taken place in many of the holidays that we partake in. If you listen to our last podcast, it was basically the history, the origins of Halloween. And I can't remember if I used the word, but I figure let me just focus on what that word means in this next podcast, because it's really I think this particular episode and the origins of the particular holiday that I'm going to focus on today is really the epitome and the example of amalgamation. So when we spoke about Halloween last episode, we saw how it originated with the Celts and Druidic priests who were kind of the leaders and the elders of the people. They were, again, called magician sages. And they were basically like the religious leaders. Like you might think of the Pharisees were the religious leaders of the Jews. The Druids were the religious leaders, priests, that kind of were the people looked up to in Celtic history. And they conducted divination and sacrifices among many other things. And they were, if you look at the what's been described, they were into the powers of shape-shifting and incantation and trance and dressing as animals and very shamanistic. You would see that really looks like a lot of witchcraft, a lot of what might be considered superstitious acts and superstitious rituals. But nevertheless, you look into the history of many nations, many cultures, many peoples, they all had this type of history in their past. And so the Celts were unlike any other, were very much like all others, excuse me. And what we see as we looked at the history of it, its progression started to morph into new things because the Catholic Church came in and they made some modifications. And so they mixed, which is the word, the blending of cultures is what's described in Merriam-Webster. And I just see a blending of Catholic Church rituals and the Celtic rituals and traditions of the Druids, and they melded them together and they came out with something that was kind of like the old, but it was just kind of new. And so that's where I feel like this word amalgamation is so appropriate. And so I'm not going to rehash the last episode. You can listen to the last episode if you missed it, and it focused on the origins of Halloween. But in this particular episode, we're going to focus on the holiday that is the the sacred golden cow of holidays, and it's Christmas. And it is that sacred golden cow for many different reasons. I think in America, it is the holiday that is most celebrated by families. Probably the holiday most celebrated by any church. Catholic, Protestant, Mormon, they celebrate Christmas. It's probably the most popular of the holidays. And it's the one that is probably the most difficult for some to come to terms with in regards to its history and its origin. And it's also difficult, I think, being in America, raised in America, because it's so beautiful. Let's just be honest. Christmas is if you look at it aesthetically, just for its aesthetics, it's beautiful. You got the lights. You got the vibrant colors of red and green and white again. You have the decorations, some of the decorations that are tied to Christmas, is that Nutcracker statue, that Nutcracker man from the Nutcracker itself. You've got the beautiful green pine tree wreaths. You've got snowflakes, the ornaments. You see those everywhere. You got the red and gold garlands. You've got Frosty the Snowman. It just markets itself so easily to so many differing ages of people, from young to old. It's just very attractive, if you will. You've got the colored balls on the Christmas tree, the colored ornaments on the Christmas tree. You've got, oh my goodness, you've got the stockings. Everybody has their stockings that they put on the walls. You've got the big red bows. You've got the reindeer. Oh, the beautiful reindeer, You've got Santa Claus and Mrs. Claus, and you got all the gifts, and you've got this idea of some, almost divine-like being who knows every child on the face of the earth, who's naughty and who's nice, and is traveling around the world to try to give presents to those that are nice, and those that are naughty either don't get any presents or get less presents. I mean, you've got the carolers, over the American cultural history. You've got the caroling going about that's tied to this particular holiday. And then obviously you got your nativity scenes. And then they mix, Christian stories, if you will. And so I say all that in the beginning because I hope that as I just simply go over the history and share its facts with you, that you will see, wow, I didn't know this. And I felt the same way in 2008. I had never studied it before, and I, for the first time, looked into it with my children. We went to the library. We went to study about these holidays and just get a truth from a historical perspective on how did it come about? Like, why is it so popular in all of these things? And so that's what we're going to do today. And I'm not here to convince you one way or the other. I will share my perspective at the end. You probably already to some extent know, but you may not know why. And I'll leave that for the end, my own, holiday take. But I just want to share with you the history and probably share with you some scriptures that I think should be considered, as you go before the Lord, as I challenged you at the end of the last episode, and make the Lord, the Word of God, your final authority in these matters. So I begin with, in about 2008, we were using an encyclopedia, the World Book Encyclopedia, and it was the 2008 version. And one of the first things that it said was, no one knows the exact date of Christ's birth. We can look in the Bible, and I don't think we know anybody's particular birth date. I mean, you pick any character you want. I don't think we know anybody's particular, hey, they were born on such and such date, like we know, our own birthday or our parents' birthdays or our siblings' birthdays or our cousins or our uncles and aunts. We know their actual birth date. We've recorded them. All we know in the Bible is that they were born. It didn't signify, they were born in such and such date of the month of Nisan or whatever month that they were in. We just know that they were born. So that was one of the first things it said. No one knows the exact date of Christ's birth. Now, it also spoke about the actual word Christmas. And the origin of the word Christmas comes from Christes Mas, M-A-E-S-S-E. Christes Mas. It is an early English phrase that means the Mass of Christ. So that's already giving you an indication of, where did that come from? Christ Mass. Christes Mass. I mean, maybe you never kind of delved into just the word Christmas. We just say Christmas so often that we don't actually break it up into its compound words, Christ Mass. And so that has to do with a particular, very, very, probably the most popular religion in the world today. But we'll get to that a little bit later. The first mention of December 25th as the birth date of Christ was not in the first century, which is when Christ was born. We believe he was born around 31 AD. I mean, don't really have the actual, again, birth date. We just know it was around that time. We've done, some historical comparative analyses between what was recorded in the scriptures and tried to pinpoint the time. And we kind of pinpointed to right around 30, 31, 33, somewhere in that range. But we don't know the month and we don't know the day. But the celebration of December 25th, again, did not happen in the first century when he was actually born, didn't happen in the second century, didn't happen in the third century. It happened in the 4th century. So we're talking about 300 to 400 years after Christ was born that we started to designate a particular day to his birthday. And we designated it as December 25th. And it was in 336 AD in an early Roman calendar where we see that. Okay, so historical evidence is supporting that that's when there was kind of a more public acknowledgement of Christ's birth being on December 25th. It further said in the World Book Encyclopedia of the 2008 edition that ancient Romans held year-end harvest celebrations to honor Saturn. They considered Saturn to be the harvest god. It's very important to note that, when we were growing up in our schooling and we learned about history, we learned about literature, we learned about Zeus and we learned about Saturn and we learned about, all of these differing gods that we read in our literature. They were actually gods that people in times past revered. They venerated them. They considered them to be gods. So they're not just simple stories. They were actually stories of gods that they believed in, that they worshiped, that they venerated. And we see them through historical analysis when we look in excavations of different things. We realize, oh, wow, they built a statue to the god of such and such and the god of such and such. But going back to the ancient Romans, at the year end, they held harvest celebrations to honor Saturn. And it said Mithras, the god of light. At the end of the year, at the end of the Roman calendar year, the Romans held celebrations to honor two in particular gods: Saturn, the harvest god, and Mithras, the god of light. I don't want you to forget Mithras, because we're going to get back to Mithras, because it's very important to see the connection and how this amalgamation just continued to progress year after year, century after century. But to just hone in on Mithras briefly, Mithra started actually not in Rome, in Persia. Now, this is where I bring in a little bit of the scriptural, biblical history. The Jews were taken over by two empires. The Assyrians took over the northern kingdom of Israel. The southern kingdom of Israel was taken over by Babylon. So Assyria took over the northern kingdom first, and then several years down the line, the Babylonian kingdom empire grew to such power that they not only took over the Assyrians, who had already taken over the northern kingdom of Judah, the Babylonians took over the southern kingdom as well. And that's where you get the 70 years that the Israelites were in the Babylonian captivity. That was all prophetic and prophesied through Daniel. And if you read the ending of Second Chronicles and Second Kings, you kind of get a feel for, when the Babylonian kingdom took over Israel. So after the Babylonian kingdom, historically, biblically, came the next empire that took over the Babylons, which was the Medes and the Persians. So the encyclopedia, the World Book Encyclopedia, tells us that Mithra started in Persia. Well, Persian took over the Babylonian kingdom. And if you know anything about biblical historical history, they reigned for several years. I can't remember how long it was, but they reigned for a good prominent amount of time. And then the next empire came. And that next empire was the Grecian Empire from Alexander the Great. And then he passed away, and it was, divided among his four generals. But Alexander the Great and the Grecian kingdom took over the Medes and the Persians. And I'm trying to connect the history so that you have a better understanding, because after the Grecian kingdom, after their reign, however long that was, then the Roman Empire came in. And so when the Encyclopedia Britannica tells me that Mithra, the god of light, started in Persia, well, when I look at biblical history, I realize, if Mithra started in Persia, that was a long time ago. They took over the Babylons, and then the Grecians took over the Persians, and then the Romans took over the Grecians. And so this Mithra god from Persia continued to exist through Greece, continued to exist through the Romans. And so that's why when Jesus was living in the days of his flesh during the first century, there was still this god of Mithras that was being worshipped and venerated. And this same god, Mithra, appears in ancient literature of Hinduism, the Vedas, Vedas. So over centuries of time, you had the Persians spread their worship of Mithra, sometimes called Mithraism, through Asia Minor. This is all shared with me through the World Book Encyclopedia. And it became popular with the Roman soldiers, who didn't take over Persia per se. They took over the Grecian Empire, who had previously taken over the Persian Empire. And it continued to thrive, this worship of Mithra, called Mithraism, through the different empires, even unto the Roman Empire. And Mithraism, according to the encyclopedia, spread to Europe by 100 AD. That's the first century. And it competed with the growth and the rise of Christianity until the 300s. In other words, through the 4th century. So you had these competing religions. You had this rise of Christianity. And if you've read the book of Acts and you've looked into the history of the growth of the church from there, you'd realize, oh, wow, Mithra, the worship of Mithra through the Roman soldiers and probably others was continuing on. It wasn't really mentioned or named in the Bible per se, but when you look at it historically and you compare both, even historians saying, yes, during the rise of Christianity, it began to compete with an already established religion that didn't come from the Romans, but that some of the Roman soldiers practiced, that didn't come from Greece, who they had conquered before, but it actually came from Persia, who Greece had conquered before them. So when I first got this, I was like, wow, I really did not know this. This is interesting. So there's this god, this harvest god, Saturn, that the ancient Romans celebrated, and the god of light called Mithras. But Mithras didn't come from the Romans. It came from the Persians, who were two empires before that. And there's a reason why the encyclopedia was sharing this. So then we looked elsewhere because we were kind of interested in, wow, we didn't know that. So let's look elsewhere. So we started looking on the internet on history.com. Now, history.com today is very different than history.com was in 2008, in 2009 when we used it. They've done a lot of changes, and there was a lot of things that we found through history.com that I actually can't find now. But the good thing was we took really good notes back then. I mean, we were typing on our laptops and typing on our computers and, just trying to sometimes copying and pasting from there so that we would have the research, like you do when you do a research paper, you copy the pages and you hold on to them and you highlight and underline the points that you think you'll use in a paper, which is what we were doing at the time because I was, using this as a project to teach our children how to write papers, argumentative papers, persuasive papers, and stuff like that. So when we looked at the history of .com, it tells us this. It gave it some information confirming what we saw, but also some extra other information that we didn't know. And so the history.com tells about the real story of Christmas. It talked about first Germany. It says that in Germany, people worshipped Odin. There's another god who made nocturnal flights through the sky. By the way, Odin, if you're interested in the MCU, you would have probably heard that before. Oh, Odin. Oh, isn't that the father of Thor or the dad of Thor? Yeah, Odin, that Odin. Well, MCU is not so original, if as you may have thought. They've taken stuff from times past and just kind of made new stories out of them. So anyways, this Odin, who was worshipped by the Germans, made nocturnal flights through the sky. They were observing the people to see who would prosper or perish. So what the people did, believing in this Odin god who made these nocturnal flights through the sky, looking down on the people to see who was going to live, who was going to die, who was going to prosper, who was going to perish, the people stayed in their homes for fear of him. And so those little seeds, those little characteristics that we see in Odin became characteristics of the future Santa Claus. Obviously, you might have already seen some of the similarities there. But then it went on to share about a festival called Saturnalia. So the history.com was telling about the real story of Christmas. It started about some of the ideas that came out from Germany, but then it went to a festival called Saturnalia. And under that was the Romans celebrated in December a harvest festival honoring Saturn. So there we had a confirmation between what we read in the encyclopedia and what we saw on history.com. And we were like, oh, that's interesting as well. And so they started to describe this festival, and what the Romans did in celebrating this festival in December, honoring Saturn, was the masters became slaves and the slaves became masters. It says that the schools and the businesses closed and everyone was just having a huge party. That's what history.com shared with us. And some more information regarding Saturnalia and the festival, it said that the upper classes of Romans celebrated Mithra, the god of the unconquerable sun. So it was a sun god. This Mithra that the Romans were celebrating, says the upper class Romans. Now, when we read the encyclopedia, it told us that it was let me go back to it again. It just said ancient Romans. Oh, no. And then it said it became popular among Roman soldiers. So ancient Romans were celebrating Mithraism, and it was very popular amongst the Roman soldiers. And so we here have confirmation through history.com that it was the upper class of Romans that celebrated Mithra, the god of the unconquerable sun. And listen to the date. On December 25th. That was completely eye-opening to me. Again, the first encyclopedia said that the first mention of December 25th as the birth date for Christ was in 336 AD according to the Roman calendar. Okay? And then when we go to history.com, that's giving us a little bit more in-depth information as to this Saturnalia festival. It says here that Mithra, the god of the unconquerable sun in whom they were worshiping, was celebrated and worshipped on December 25th, which happened to have been the date that Christ started being celebrated in 336 AD, literally 300 to 400 years later. That was very interesting. Now, Mithra was an infant god born of rock. And so for some Romans, Mithra's birthday was the most sacred day of the year. Now, if that doesn't catch your attention, I'm not sure what will. Because according to what we are so far, according to what we have just gathered in information, December 25th, again, first, remember it stated, no one knows the exact date of Christ's birth. And we can look at some analysis and realize that according to the biblical historical record, there's really no possible way he was born on December 25th. Because the shepherds keeping watch over their flock by night, where the angels came to announce and proclaim that the birth of Christ, their Savior, was born, would never have happened during December 25th, because that region was so cold, you would not find shepherds out at night keeping their flocks in that weather. It just wouldn't happen. It just doesn't make any sense for Christ to have been born in December. Okay? So that's just one thing that I'll bring to you. It wasn't in the World Book Encyclopedia, but it's just to understand that the only reason that there's a celebration of December 25th is, number one, the ancient Romans designated it for that day, which we haven't gotten into why. But now we realize, why did they even choose that day? Why not December 26th? Why not December 30th? Why not December 5th? It is because the Romans were already worshiping another god called Mithra or Mithras. It was the god of the unconquerable sun. This infant god born of rock was already being celebrated on December 25th. So here's what happened. In the 4th century, which is, between 300 and 400 AD, the church officials, now we're talking about the Roman Catholic Church. If you know anything about history, you know that the Roman Empire did not start out as a religious power. It started out as a national power like that of Greece, like that of Persia, like that of Babylon, like that of Assyria. It was just a nation of people that just grew and rose to power. The Roman Church, during its waning years of power, the Roman Empire, during its waning years of power, became a power again as a religious entity. So here, when it says in the 4th century, the church officials, they're talking about the Roman Catholic Church. They decided to institute the birth of Jesus as a holiday. All of a sudden, in the 4th century, the Roman Catholic Church decided to institute December 25th as a holiday for the birth of Jesus. So this is a Roman Catholic thing. Previously, it was a Mithraism veneration. So Pope Julius I chose December 25th, and it is commonly believed that the church chose this date in an effort to adopt and absorb the traditions of the pagan Saturnalia festival. This all comes from history.com. By holding Christmas at the same time as a traditional winter solstice festival, the church leaders increased the chances that Christmas would be popularly embraced. By the Middle Ages, Christianity had, and they say Christianity, but it's really Catholicism. I differentiate between the two. I can talk about why later on, but I differentiate between the two because being a Christian and following after Christ was not Catholicism. It was not Baptist. It was not, what are the other ones? It was not Protestant. It was not Lutheran. It was not Calvin. It was not any of that. Being a Christian was completely independent of all the other Christian religions that we know of. And right now there's 45,000 plus differing Christian religions out there. So when we saw that, our children began to realize, I think, for the first time, why their own parents did not celebrate Christmas. And personally speaking, as I make this podcast, I'm letting you all know, I did not know any of this stuff until I looked into it myself. I just simply didn't partake in Christmas. It wasn't a big deal for or against it, but you know, I looked into a little bit and I was like, yeah, no. But this began to fully persuade me in my own mind. History.com continued on the evolution of Santa Claus. So Santa Claus comes from a monk, or the idea, the idea, the inception of this idea of Santa Claus began with a monk who was born in around 280 AD, and he was named Saint Nicholas. And he was very much admired for his piety and his kindness. And again, saints are really under the umbrella of who? The Catholic Church, which is not something that I'm even a part of. But it's good to know for history. So he became the subject of many legends over the years. And he became most popular saint in Europe, even unto the Protestant Reformation. So if you know anything about history, church history, you know, for most of the Dark Ages, the Roman Catholic Church was in power as the religious entity that it was. It grew and grew in power because of keeping the populace in ignorance and keeping them as the sole, source of knowledge and wisdom and all of this stuff. And obviously during the production of the Bible and the printing of the Bible, that really helped in this Protestant Reformation that happened about, if you know anything about history and church history. So this particular idea of this saint continued on through the Catholic Church, even through its rise of power, but it also, I'll use the word infected, even the Protestant Reformation, because they still held on to this particular person. Even though the Protestant Church wanted to do away with the veneration of saints, because they were breaking away from the Catholic Church and they didn't like a lot of the things that the Catholic Church was doing, Catholic Church was teaching, but they still, he was still popular under the Protestants during this time. And then it also spoke of the Dutch. The Dutch name of Sinterklaas was a shortened form of Saint Nicholas, which is where Santa Claus was derived from. So the notoriety of Santa Claus, like the actual word Santa Claus, that really grew in New York at the end of the 1700s. And then there was a particular famous American author named Washington Irving who popularized Santa Claus. And he referred to him as the patron saint of New York. So that's a lot of information. I mean, we could go in and talk about the American progression and history of Christmas and Santa Claus. And I think I mentioned that in our last podcast that in America, big businesses just take advantage of the holidays to make money. I would venture to guess that Christmas time is probably the biggest, most money-making event for most every big business. By far, I would venture to say that. That's where everybody's buying gifts and gifts and gifts and more gifts. So the people are spending their money to buy gifts for one another, and the big businesses are just getting fat off of it. And so we see a tremendous amount of marketing around the Christmas time. You've probably noticed that there's a huge amount of marketing during Christmas time. Why? Because that's where they're making a huge, talking not just millions of dollars. We're talking, this is $1 billion industry of making money during the Christmas time. And just taking advantage of the fact that people, have this idea about Christmas being about this and about that and about this and about giving gifts and exchanging gifts and all of these things. And they're just being taken advantage of. But I'm trying to focus on the spiritual aspects, because as a Christian, I think we need to consider the origins of things. And I'm going to reiterate again what we found on history.com, just to emphasize the importance of how this came about. The ancient Romans had a year-end celebration, year-end meaning in December, and they were honoring Saturn and Mithras. The worship of Mithras did not start in Rome. It started in Persia. This is the same kingdom that was conquered by Babylon. Mithras is the same god as Mithra that appears in the ancient literature of Hinduism. The Persians spread this worship of Mithra, called Mithraism, throughout Asia Minor, which is where Paul did his travels. Paul did his 3 or 4 travels, when he was preaching the gospel and traveling about, he was going through Asia Minor. And so the fact is that Mithraism actually became popular among Roman soldiers and the upper class of Rome. They were celebrating Mithra as well as the god of the unconquerable sun on December 25th. And Mithras was the infant god, born of rock. Now, for some Romans, Mithra's birthday was the most sacred day of the year, and it competed with it was written in Christianity, but it's really Catholicism. It competed with, let's go back to the beginning. Mithraism competed with the rise of, I would say, the Christian movement, not really Catholicism, but the Christian movement in the first century. What happened was, after the first century, it began to get hijacked. And that's where this Roman Catholicism started to rise in the second, in the third, into the fourth century, and then all through the Dark Ages. So there was this, I guess, battle of dominance between the rise of following after Christ in the first century, which then got hijacked into the Roman Catholicism, and the worship of Mithra. Again, 300 years down the line in the 4th century, Pope Julius I chose December 25th. Why? Because they were already worshiping the sun god Mithra. And so in order to adopt and absorb the differing pagans that were around, the Roman Catholic Church decided, let's do this. Let's celebrate Jesus on December 25th, and that will help amalgamate them into the church and get them into the church. And amalgamation is a mixture. So they're mixing the things of Mithraism into what the Catholics or the Catholic Church, their rituals, their ideas and thoughts, and they mix them together to form some sort of new type of holiday, which they coined Christ Mass, which is interesting because a Mass is really held for the dead, and yet you're trying to celebrate Christ's birth. Contradiction? Yes, I would say so. But continuing on, that's what it was for. This information is not secret, guys. It's not some sort of conspiracy theory. I would simply challenge you, look up the history of the origins of Christmas. Look up the history of Mithra. Look up the history of Mithraism. I'm just giving you the key words so that you know at least what to search for. Look up the words Saturnalia or ancient Roman festivals, ancient Roman winter festivals, and you'll find it in an encyclopedia. You'll find it in your local library, and all you need to do is verify the facts. But there was an old adage that was used during my youth. It was WWJD. What would Jesus do? So I bring it now back to the Bible. I read the scriptures and I simply do not see Jesus celebrating his own birthday. I look at the scriptures and I see that the Jews that lived in Jesus' day did not worship other gods. Their God was one. Their God was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They had no other gods. They lived according to the Shema, Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Lord, or hear ye, the Lord your God is one. And so when I think about what would Jesus do, would he be involved in elevating, venerating Mithra during the 1st century? I trow not. If he were living in the 2nd century, the 3rd century, the 4th century, would he be promoting and advocating what the Catholic Church did in designating December 25th as his own day of birth, which was completely not true? It was actually what the Romans considered the birth of Mithra, the infant god of rock. Would he begin to partake in those celebrations and rituals that the Catholic Church now wanted to designate in the 4th century on December 25th as Christ's Mass? Would Jesus be a part of that? I don't see any indication why he would do such a thing. So I wanted to remind you of what we read in the last podcast, Jeremiah 10. hear the word which the Lord speaks to you, O house of Israel. He was speaking that to the Israelites, who eventually became the Jews that lived in Jesus' day. Thus says the Lord, do not learn the way of the Gentiles. Do not be dismayed at the signs of the heaven, for the Gentiles are dismayed at them. There are some that read the next few verses and they feel like, oh my God, that was Christmas. Look at it, look at it. And so I'm going to read it. For the customs of the peoples are futile. Verse 3 of Jeremiah 10. For one cuts a tree from the forest, the work of the hands of the workmen with the axe. Verse 4, they decorate it with silver and gold. They fasten it with nails and hammers so that it will not topple. They are upright like a palm tree, and they cannot speak. They must be carried because they cannot go by themselves. Do not be afraid of them, for they cannot do evil, nor can they do any good. Now, some people read those scriptures. Christians will read those scriptures. Oh, yeah, you see how they cut in that tree from the forest and they were decorating it with silver and gold and they were fastening it down with nails and hammers so that it wouldn't fall over. Yeah, that's the Christmas tree. Some people will say that. And I am the type of person that believes you first need to understand the scriptures in context. Because Jeremiah was not speaking it to me in the year 2021. He was speaking it to the people living in his day and what they were doing. So it first must apply to them. So when I read those scriptures, okay, well, what were his brothers and sisters doing that the Lord was having such issues with? Well, they were cutting down trees. Okay, trees is wood, and they were fashioning it because the work of the hands of the workmen was fashioning it, and they were decorating this piece of wood with silver and gold, and they were nailing it down so that it wouldn't fall over. And it was standing up like a palm tree, yet it didn't speak. And it had to be carried about everywhere they went because it can't walk by itself. It can't move by itself. Well, what is that describing? Well, for me, that's describing idols. They were chopping down trees, carving them out into idols. Sometimes they were idols of stone. Sometimes they were idols of wood, but they were idols. And so that's what these scriptures were addressing. Now, some may read those same scriptures and say, yeah, but you know what? It definitely applied to the people of that day because it had to. It was spoken to them. Yet it could be prophetic. And so some people may, in the vein or the idea of it being prophetic, that God was giving an indication through the words that were recorded of what that would morph into, what that might look like in the future. So some people might see, oh yeah, that looks like the Christmas tree. I'm not here to debate the matter, whether here or there, but I will say this. After we researched this and I realized the history, I guess the scripture that came to my mind was the following. 1 John 1:5. This is the message which we have heard from him and declare to you, that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. He is light. There is no darkness in him. He is pure. There is no impurity in him. He is holy. There is nothing profane in him. And he is truth. There is no lie that he is going to continue and promote and propagate, because in him he is light and there is no darkness at all. So I submit that all to you for your consideration as you go before the Lord and allow him to be your final word. Think on these things and hear what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Thus is the ministry of our Father's heart through us. Our utmost desire is to be in the Father's heart, to know the Father's heart, and express the Father's heart to you. If you appreciate listening to this podcast and were blessed, pass it along to someone else by text, email, or word of mouth in the hopes that they might be positively impacted as you were. If you are interested in supporting our efforts, we would ask you to consider the following. 1, pray for us. 2, leave a positive rating or review with whomever you listen to our podcast with. And 3, if you desire to contribute monetarily, you can do so at paypal.me/JBenJesus or Cash App $JBenJesus or Venmo JBenJesus. That's JBenJesus. God bless.